This is a reading from Matthew chapter 27. As they went out, they came upon a man from Cyrene named Simon. They compelled this man to carry his cross. The word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. That's all we get about Simon of Cyrene in Matthew, this year's gospel. Just one sentence that mentions, almost in passing, the burden that Simon of Cyrene was made to bear. We get a little more in Mark, which is surprising because Mark is the shortest of the Gospels, but not much more. Still, just one sentence, still just one verse. But in Mark, we learn that Simon was heading into the city as the crucifixion cohort was going out to Golgotha, and we learned the names of his two sons. Mark's text is this: they compelled a passerby who was coming in from the country to carry his cross. It was Simon of Cyrene, the father of Alexander and Rufus. Cyrene is in North Africa, present-day Libya. Religious art often depicts Simon as African for this reason. Greeks had founded the city of Cyrene more than 650 years before the day that Simon was compelled to carry Jesus' cross. The two boys certainly have Greek names, Alexander and Rufus, but Simon carries a Hebrew name, so we surmise that he was in Jerusalem for the Passover, but we really don't know. What we do know, based just on Matthew's brief record, is that he was compelled to do this. That alone tells us a great deal. Simon had not begun his day planning to carry Jesus' cross from Jerusalem to Golgotha. And based on Mark's somewhat more ample information, we know that Simon was headed into town when suddenly he was made to turn around and go back out of town, fulfilling a duty not of his choosing. This alone gives us some point of connection with Simon, for we are all today carrying a burden that we did not choose. We did not choose to suspend congregational worship. We did not choose to close our buildings to the public. We did not choose to keep social distance from others, to shoulder the responsibility of restricting our actions to keep others from getting sick. We did not choose this, and Simon did not choose that, so we have at least that in common with him. So working out from our experience then to his, we can imagine that he had a very different purpose that day coming into Jerusalem, a purpose that was important to him. We can imagine him working to accomplish his day's goals with focus, whatever they may have been. Coming in from the country, rather than moving just from one building to another in town, we can imagine that he had some things with him, and that being compelled to carry Jesus' cross meant that he was forced to leave those things right there and walk away from them, carrying the burden that was imposed upon him. We don't know this, of course, but we certainly have left many things behind as our attention has turned to a duty that we did not choose, a burden that we were not expecting to bear. 10 days ago, we all suddenly felt that we put down what had seemed so important to us at the time in order to take up the new burden that turned us around and started us in a different direction, down a different path. So we share that with Simon. I think we share a sense of fear with him as well, at least uncertainty, if not foreboding or dread. We don't know where this path will take us. We don't know what we're headed into. And we can imagine Simon wondering what would happen to him as he showed up carrying a cross to an execution site, might the soldiers just assume that he was the one to be crucified? We can imagine his fear being very much like our fear as we take a few more steps down this path that we had not planned to be on even a few days ago. Where will it lead us? And what will happen when we get there? Now, at this point, preachers might wax poetic about the profound conversion that must have taken place in Simon's life that day, such that he and his family became so well known in the early church that St. Mark, writing his gospel, just assumed that every reader would know Alexander and Rufus. But I'm not going to go there. Or preachers may turn theological and notice how Jesus was with Simon the whole way, start to finish, on his unexpected journey, and that in leaving his planned path for that day, Simon drew closer to Jesus than he otherwise would have done. But I'm not going to go there either. Instead, what I want to recall with you is what Jesus said in his first major discourse in Matthew, in the Sermon on the Mount. Among 100 other things that Jesus taught in that address about how to live a life of discipleship, he told the crowds, "And if anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go also the 2nd mile." This little phrase is in the midst of the part of the Sermon on the Mount calling the disciples to resist retaliation, to resist self-protection, and the place where, oddly enough, Jesus says, "Do not resist an evildoer." We're heading into week 2 today, the 2nd mile, as it were. We have every reason to believe that this detour from where we had intended to go this year in the season of Lent in our congregations or in our ministry sites, we believe that detour will continue some weeks yet. And I expect we will feel on our shoulders, metaphorically, the scrapes and bruises from having carried this burden for a long time to come, as I suspect Simon did as well. But notice this: there are children, Alexander and Rufus, and they seem to be well known to the community of faith that lived after Jesus' unexpected arrest and trial and crucifixion and burial. There are children, and there is a community of faith that continues after the great trauma that it experienced, the path it had not planned to go down, the detour it was compelled to make. Even in the one short verse about St. Simon of Cyrene that St. Mark gives us, there's a sign of hope, and there's evidence of a future that we can see clearly. And so my prayer for all of you, for us together, for our church, is that as we continue down this unexpected path, carrying a burden we did not choose to carry, that we will also come to the day when this crisis is past and the church continues on in whatever shape it continues from one generation to another, as it has always done. And that the church in each generation may continue to find that its greatest joy is the solemn wonder of Jesus' death and resurrection. Let us pray. The Lord be with you. Eternal God, amid all the turmoil and changes of the world, your love is steadfast and your strength never fails. In this time of trouble and danger, be to us a sure guardian and rock of defense. Guide the leaders of our nation with your wisdom. Comfort those in distress. Give our congregations courage and hope. Help us to believe that you have a future prepared for us. Through Jesus Christ, our Savior and Lord. Amen. I am going to continue with a little bit of a history of what has got us to this place relative to the proposed budget for 2021. In case you did not come into this meeting already being completely aware of this, our 3 spring luncheons that we normally have historically would be the same presentation in 3 geographic places. That's been blown up. And so since we're meeting by video conference and there is not as great a stamina to sit in a chair and look at a computer screen for a long period of time as there is to be with the people of God gathered in community around worship and around conversation and around presentations and around a meal and all the downtime and side conversations that happen in between, we decided that we would take the one presentation and divide it into the 3 meetings so that each would have its own flavor and we would have more opportunity to check in with each other. So our last gathering, we debriefed a little bit of what took place at the Conference of Bishops meeting and the Church Council meeting held jointly at the beginning of this month. At this meeting, we're going to focus on the proposed budget for 2021. And then at our next gathering, we're going to talk about our Synod Assembly. That's our plan and the flow. So our conversation today is the budget for 2021. What I want to do is give you just a little bit of history of where we are so that you have a context within which to work. The first thing I want to remember with you is that at our 2019 Synod Assembly, we received a motion from the floor mandating that the Synod Council bring a balanced budget to the 2020 Synod Assembly for 2021. That was in fact already in the mind of the Synod Council, in that the 5-point plan that the Synod Council brought to the 2019 Synod Assembly included the intention to have a balanced budget for 2021. So in that sense, the Synod Council and the Assembly were on the same page, but in both of those have led us to the place where our Budget and Finance Committee was charged with creating a budget that would be a balanced budget for 2021. On January 28th, the way that we normally do this in normal circumstances is that the Budget and Finance Committee brings a draft budget to the January Synod Council meeting. The January Synod Council then reviews it and gives recommendations for any changes. And then the Budget and Finance Committee brings back to the March Synod Council meeting a proposed budget that the Synod Council normally would adopt and prepare to forward to the Synod Assembly as the proposed budget. So in normal time then, that budget would be printed in the Bulletin of Reports, made available to the ministerium at the conference meetings ahead of Synod Assembly. And so the timing of that draft in January and proposed budget in March has been our normative practice. So in January, we brought that to the Synod Council. The Synod Council reviewed the work of the Budget and Finance Committee and left it pretty well intact, saying that it looks as good as we could imagine, let's move forward with it. We entered into communication then with our ministry partners to say, we want you to know this is what we are looking at for 2021, which is again our normal practice, sharing information and keeping our ministry partners close in that way. So then at our executive committee meeting on Thursday, the plan was to receive that, see if there was any substantive response from ministry partners that would require a change, and then recommend the same budget to the Synod Council that will be meeting on Saturday of this week, the 28th. But as it turned out, just a day before the executive committee meeting, Bob Cairns noticed some details that he believed were not as precisely accurate as they could be, especially in expenses relative to the Synod office. Now, you know that we are in the process right now of selling the Synod office and looking to lease a space, and our budget for leasing is about $70,000, and I think that's about what we have in the budget. And Bob was looking at that saying, maybe it'll be more like 80,000. And so some of those details of anticipated expenses became known to the executive committee without very much time to address them thoughtfully. The executive committee wrestled with that a little bit on Thursday and ended up deciding we're going to ask the committee to take some time and revise this more fully before bringing it to the Synod Council meeting on Saturday. So that was one of the things that has just very recently taken place. And then, and you need to know this, at the same executive committee meeting on Thursday, the executive committee acted to recommend to the Synod Council that we postpone our Synod Assembly until the fall. This is happening all across our church. It comes with the encouragement of our presiding bishop. What we are finding in some places across our church where assemblies are in April or May, the venues where the Synod Assembly was planned to be held themselves are saying, we're not going to be open then, so we need to change. In other places where the assembly is later, like ours in June, there is that weighing of timing. Do we go ahead and register for assembly and then have to change everything? Do we wait and see how things are going and then feel like we're behind? So weighing all these things together, the executive committee acted on Thursday to recommend to our Synod Council, which will not be meeting till Saturday, that we postpone our Synod Assembly until the fall. Now, the reason I am sharing this with you is because this knowledge changes a number of things. Now, I would say that very precisely, the knowledge is what the executive committee has done, not what the Synod Council has done. The Synod Council will take action on Saturday, and although I anticipate that they will affirm the recommendation of the executive committee, I don't know that. It's a live action that will happen on Saturday. But anticipating that they will, that reduces the urgency of time in any number of ways relative to our budget, because we do not then have to have a completely revised budget to give to the Synod Council on Saturday, nor do we have to have that ready then to print in the Bulletin of Reports and distribute to our Synod Assembly caucuses in that way until somewhat later. So that knowledge opens up our time and gives us more time to consider this well. And also, and this is not insignificant, it gives us time to see what will the effect of this social distancing and the suspension of worship in our buildings be on our revenue. We just don't know that at this point. Our anticipation in every congregation can only be, we know what it's like after a snow day on a Sunday. We know what it's like if there's been some other reason that we've had to not hold worship, offerings plummet. This will likely be like that. And if that's the case, then the anticipated revenue for the Synod budget will also likely be much less. Right now, we have very little data to work with, only imagination. By postponing our Synod Assembly, we may have more data as we come to April, May, and June in experience rather than imagination. All of that is just to set the context of the conversation that we were going to have then. What I would like to do is invite Pastor Stoller, if you are still here. I know that just before 10 o'clock, you've got to attend to, you're good, I see a thumbs up, excellent. I'm going to invite Pastor Stoller to share her screen with us so that we can see the work of the Budget and Finance Committee. Now that should be visible on your screen. If it is not, please say something in the chats, or please unmute and let us know, because we want to make sure that folks are following this around rather closely rather than missing out. I'm seeing a nice job. We're good. Any other comments? Mostly we're in. Okay. Now, I can't control the movement of the thing up and down. Melissa, you'll do that. So we'll do this together. But I understand that you're ready to do that. So
I'll follow your lead, Bishop. Thank you.
Okay, excellent. At our last meeting, Don Green, Pastor Green, asked a question that I think I missed. His question was, will the budget be made available to us to see before the meeting on Monday? And I heard agenda, and so I apologize for that. The answer is, we think that this is still in flux enough that sharing it in this way, looking at it together, and considering it together might be better than publishing this, because this may yet change based on how dramatic the crisis is that we're heading into. But what I'd like to do is go through each line item with a little bit of detail so that your eyes can see what the Budget and Finance Committee intends for you to see. And then we'll stop along the way for questions and answers. I know that may be challenging, because with this screen taking up most of my viewing area, I can see far fewer people than before. But we will try to manage that. So we'll start with the revenues. If you look at a graph of our revenues over the last 20 years, you will see that it is gradually declining one year after another in terms of actual mission support received, almost uniformly one year after another. I think we have had 3 years in the last 20 where the actual dollar amount of mission support revenue received was greater than the year before. But almost always our trajectory has been a little less, a little less, a little less, a little less every year, with then a great drop following the crises of 2008 and 2009 in our country and in our church, and then a kind of leveling off, and again the very small drop. 2 of those increases were since 2009, but the overall effect is that we are working with a much smaller revenue than we have had in recent memory. So that number, 1,450,000, is intended to be as accurate an anticipation as we can imagine at this point. Looking at the actual receipts for 2019, this may still be high. And if the crisis that we are currently experiencing continues for a long period of time, this may be much higher than our actual receipts. We don't know. I think this is a fair time to ask people of means who are able to contribute to support the work of the church, and I intend to do that, and I expect you intend to do that as well in your congregations. But that's the first line. The next line is a church-wide grant that helps support the work of the Director for Evangelical Mission. It is not salary. It is support. It is not enough to support the work of the Director for Evangelical Mission, but it is what we anticipate receiving as revenue from church-wide for that purpose. The next amount is trust and estate. These are receipts that we receive from investments that have fixed returns for us. The next is the legacy fund. That number is based on the stock market return for the amount of investment we have. When the stock market is roaring along, that increases. When the stock market fails, that decreases. The more of the legacy fund that we use to cover a deficit budget, the more that return, the interest on that principal also is less. The stock market was rolling along really well when the Budget and Finance Committee created this proposed budget. Since then, it has been, so, shall we say, volatile, and we just don't know what's going to happen. So that, again, may be a number that is too high.
Bishop,
The next is...
Bishop, may I speak to that just
yes, please,
briefly?
Ryan, thank you.
One thing just to understand is that that distribution rate that is set from that is based off of the last 5 years of performance, and so it's designed to be stable regardless of the immediate sways of the market. And so just understand that that number will not dramatically shift just because of the last couple months. It's going to take 5 years worth of horrible performance or something like that for it to really start to, the boat start to rock as far as how much that distribution rate will be affected. So just understand that it's based off of the last 5 years of performance, how that rate is set, and how the number is set that each person or each constituent would get the rate of return that they get from the distribution.
Good, thanks, Ryan. I appreciate that. And in fact, that is what gave the Budget and Finance Committee boldness to put a 4% interest on the next line item. Our money is invested in the ELCA Foundation Pool Trust Fund A, which is collectively a very large fund, and as Ryan was saying, is managed in such a way that they guarantee, as much as any guarantee can be held, a 4% draw for investments, and as he was saying, over the 5 years. So thank you, Ryan. I appreciate very much bringing that to our attention. So that 4% draw in $60,000 is based on clearing $1.5 million on the sale of the building and grounds, which we are heading into but do not yet have in hand. Just this week, there has been a tremendous back and forth between our attorney and the potential buyer's attorney about details of the purchase agreement. We ironed all that out, and on Saturday, I learned from our realtor that the buyer is now asking for the letter of intent to be amended from a 30-day opportunity to sign a purchase agreement to 12 weeks. I am suggesting that we say, actually, let's see if we can sign a purchase agreement within 30 days. And if not, you can still be a potential buyer, but we'll look at other potential buyers too, because I think the last thing we want is just to tie up our potential sale of the building with a buyer that is dragging their feet. Nevertheless, that's all the revenues then. You'll see $1,563,000. This was the Budget and Finance Committee's best guess at the time. It could be that these things will have to be amended as we go forward. Moving down to expenditures, some of these, and you'll see the groups that are there. So the first is our share with the church-wide organization. And you'll see that there's an asterisk beside that. The $700,000 is not 50% of $1,450,000. And Melissa, if I may ask you to scroll clear to the next page, actually, 725,000 would be the 50% that we normally anticipate sharing with the church-wide organization. In the middle of this page, where the heading is Synod Grants, the third line down, Ministry, where Melissa's cursor is, there's a $25,000 line item, grants to be given to revitalize the new ministries in our Synod. What this reflects is the creative thinking of the Budget and Finance Committee, that part of the reality is that we send revenue to the church-wide organization and we receive grants back. And when everything is going along well, that can be just fine. Recently, we have found that that process has not always met our needs in the time when we need it, or for the very specific thing that we need it. Our needs might not match the particular things that the church-wide organization is intending to grant, or the timing that we have might not match the timing of the grants of the churchwide organization. Autopilot has been turned off for some time now. And what we're finding is we need to act more quickly. So this essentially would be to say we're going to contribute 50% of our revenue, but we're going to hold what we anticipate would be grants from the churchwide organization and in-house. Now, it has the same flavor of the pilot project synods that are looking at holding a larger amount and paying for their own DEM and their own ministry grants. But just to give you a heads up of that part of the budget while we're looking at the earlier part. So Melissa, let's scroll back to expenditures. This is wonderful. This is like trying to pick something up with one hand of your own and one hand of somebody else's. It can be done. It takes a lot of coordination. So you'll see the $700,000 there. It intends to be in spirit at least, a 50% share, but withholding some of the actual money for more nimble distribution here for ministry grants. Career Development Services is a line that is for our candidacy committee to pay for psych evaluations. The candidacy committee's other funds are hotel accommodations for overnight meetings we share with West Virginia. I think, Peter, you may be able to speak to the other things that are in that $5,000 if you would like to do that.
Hi, in addition to the psychological evaluations, we also pay for background checks. Those are the two most significant expenses. There's other minor expenses that go along with getting the paperwork in order for an entrance interview. Additionally, the candidacy committee has found historically that an annual retreat with all the candidates in the process is a very valuable time in terms of building relationship between candidates and the committee itself, especially as the face of the committee changes over time. That's been something we found very valuable for candidates so that when they walk into a room for approval and 5 of the people are new from when they started candidacy 5 years before, 6 years, 7 years before, that there's some knowledge of the people that are there. And we found that really valuable. And so those kind of expenses go together. Thanks.
But thank you. Going down to the next line item, and as you look at these, you'll see that the filter for what shall we continue to support in our budget and what might we let go is driven by our mission statement that the role of the Synod is to serve, connect, and equip our congregations to do their ministry and their work. So we'll continue just holding that filter in place. When we come to the ELCA gift planner, that is our portion of supporting Ryan Ebner's work among us, together with many other ministry partners who also contribute, together with the churchwide organization through the ELCA Foundation, which contributes to his presence with us. This is an investment that I believe has a tremendous return, more than 4%. Ryan, may I simply ask you to provide to this group a ballpark or specific amount of the gifts that you closed in 2019?
Yeah, 2019 was about $4.5 million worth of intent. And so what that means is that that's not dollars in the door, but that is where people have declared their intent to give to charitable causes. Now, that number does include congregations. It includes ministries within the ELCA, as well as our regional ELCA ministries, in addition to other secular or non-ELCA entities as well. We do a comprehensive gift planning, and so in total, it's about $4.5 million that we were able to create intent, and that is in addition to the other 3 years prior that I've been working as well. And so when this starts adding up, it's something to where over the long term, we will hopefully see that everyone understands what gift planning is, and everyone has a plan, and that when people do pass on, that those gifts will be made, and they will go to support the future church as we will experience it, or maybe even beyond us experiencing it.
Thank you, Ryan. I appreciate that. Moving down to the regional churchwide expenses, our region, Region 8, does some things together, including gathering the steering committee, which is bishops and vice presidents from all the synods of our region annually, and First Call Theological Education. We used to fund together a portion of our regional coordinators' work. That has changed along the way, so that now we do not have a regional coordinator anymore, but we have a regional candidacy manager for our region and Region 7. But as Region 8, this money is used for those things, for First Call Theological Education and for a very part-time staff person to make that go forward, along with the expenses for the steering committee. Going down to the next, Tara's asking, who's our regional candidacy manager? It is Pastor Paul Baglios. Going down to the next section, building operation administrative costs. You'll see that $80,000 is in there for rent and utilities. This was our best estimate. We are looking to rent a space about 3,800 to 4,000 square feet. We are looking for space that is between $18 and $20 a square foot annually. We've found places that are really lovely for $23 a square foot. We do have a potential place not too far from the current Synod office that is $16 a square foot, and a little more space that we had thought, so that the price goes up. We're continuing to look. But what we believe is around that $70,000, we think we can lease a space. The $80,000 that is there also has an asterisk. And Melissa, is that asterisk explained somewhere else, or is it simply for us to note that this is something that we don't really have in hand yet? We're still guessing about.
That's it, Bishop. We're just not sure yet.
Yep. Thank you. So Bob Cairns replied saying, yeah, just from looking at 2019's expenses, he thinks that might be a little low. So bear that in mind as well as we go forward. Legal and accounting, that is our audit and what we pay to our Synod attorney. Our Synod attorney has been very busy recently with any number of things in our congregations. Our rule of thumb is if a congregation is able to pay for the attorney's fees for things like closing or merging or things like that, well and good. If not, the Synod pays for that as part of our partnership support of our congregations. The next is the staff, the Synod staff support, and we'll go through each of those again just to give some clarity. The Synod treasurer stipend is a new thing. We have found it has been an extraordinary and unexpected challenge to appoint a treasurer for our Synod who remains in place for a full term. I think in the Harry Potter world, it's like the defense of for the dark arts teacher that is gone every year. It just seems we can't keep a treasurer. And one of the things we have heard as feedback from those who have considered the position and have declined, from those who have held the position not for very long, is that some token of stipend for the time spent would be helpful. So we have put into that line item $6,000 in order to make it perhaps more attractive for someone to consider that position. The next line item is new, and it is something we have needed for a long time. I believe that most of you on this call are aware of how quickly our communication has greatly improved. This was our Synod Council's #1 priority, our strategic initiative to improve communication throughout our Synod, to invest in that, in fact. And this is a result of doing that work and intending to continue to do it well. The Director for Evangelical Mission Administrative Support, this would be paying for Marty Burkett to come in to the office a few hours at peak times during the year when mission support mailings and accounting of gifts needs to be done. And that's a stipend for her for that work. Then we have one of the largest items in our budget, which is the staff compensation and housing. This reflects our intention not to fill the vacancy that was left by Pastor Sarah's transition to Holy Trinity in Emmanuel, which again is a reflection of a reduction in office staff that the office is attempting to make the norm rather than to go back to the staff that we had before. Staff pension and benefits reflects the same thing, as well as employment taxes and insurance. In travel and meetings, we have gone from leasing 4 cars to 3. It looks like for the time being, all of our meetings will be online. So I don't know what that will mean for expenses. I know that the Synod car that is assigned for my use has been sitting there for a while these days. So I don't know whether that line item will turn out to be larger than we need, but that's the best guess that we had on actual expenses over the years for travel and meetings. So that whole section then you'll see is a significant amount, but I would offer this interpretation. If our synod per se, I mean we are all synod, but the synod office, the middle judicatory that is the synod, is a service or a product. The thing that is most valuable, the product and service that is most valuable, is the expertise of our staff. I just think that it is important to know the thing that we do is connect and serve and equip. And those are all relationship things. And this is, in a sense, the centerpiece of what our synod does. Now, as we get into other expenditures, you'll see that this budget reflects a significant shift from budgets in the past, and we'll come to that in a minute. But I want to share with you that the mission of our synod is what is driving the shape of this budget. We'll go down to synod ministry, and as I come to the end of the budget, then I appreciate that you are holding and noting your questions so we can have a robust conversation when we get to the end. Not too long ago, so we're in synod ministry and the line item hospitality. Not too long ago, each of our committees had a line item for its own use. And very often our committees, even synod council, had a line item for providing meals for meetings and things like that. All those line items are gone. They're just not in the budget anymore. So this is an attempt to put some money back in for exactly that kind of thing, just a little bit of hospitality. The $2,000 for family systems and conflict management is to have Pastor Asplin complete the work of the academy that he's participating in the synod, and I'll let him explain that a little bit.
Hi all. Bishop Kessler has asked me to become a part of the presiding bishop's Family Systems Academy. One of the goals of the academy is that each synod would have a project within it that makes use of the learning we're doing, which comes from Bowen and Friedman in particular. Our partners in Northeast Ohio for years have had a family systems team who are a group of pastors and lay people who are well educated in family systems, who work the theory well, and then who are available to congregations both on a case-by-case situation and long-term for assistance and consulting. developing one of those teams is a long-term project, and hopefully will begin next year, not in 2020, but rather in 2021.
Thank you, Peter. The next line item is Synod grants, and you will see some things that are familiar. There's an emphasis on youth and an emphasis on new ministries. I think that, again, the filter that we've been using is to ask, what can the Synod office, the middle judicatory per se, accomplish in the larger life of our church that is harder for congregations themselves or the church-wide organization to accomplish? And this section of the budget attempts to give an answer to that. I'll ask Pastor Stoller to correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe the new and renewed partner ministries are a carryover from budgets past. Is that correct, Melissa?
That's correct. We have used that to come alongside some of the new ministries that didn't fit quite into the same category that the ELCA had. So for example, some of our ecumenical new ministries, and had used that as a way to fund and support them as well. So that was a carryover in that sense.
Good, thank you. And then the $25,000 we explained a little bit earlier in the shared revenue with the church-wide organization. We'll come to the last section. I find this to be the most emotionally charged section. And that, I think, is because there are faces that we can see and stories of people that we have heard relative to this section that is much more the case than in some of the other sections. At our Synod Assembly, when we hear about the work that Lutherland and Agape, our camps, do in the lives of children, when we hear about students at one of the Pittsburgh universities or at Thiel College, when we hear about graduates from our seminaries, and in particular our partner seminary, ULS, when we hear about the Christmas gifts that our members have brought to Glade Run, or the stories of how lives are changed up in Meadville, when we see the video of our seniors talking about their life of faith that is nurtured in Zelienople, and these days my parents among them, our work of advocacy, our work of ecumenism, these are stories, these are people, and this section is the most emotional for us. And I think if you remember Synod Assemblies past, this is the place where most of the floor debate centers, because this is the most emotional for us. I believe this is the most challenging part of a fundamental shift that we are making in our Synod. And I'll say just a word about that. I know that I'm going on for a long time, but I think it's important to hear this perspective. In the late 1700s into the early 1800s, the work of our Synod, the Ministerium of Pennsylvania, was to help create a common liturgy for the wilderness churches and scattered churches of Lutherans in Pennsylvania, and to create a seminary system by which local students could be raised up to be pastors for the next generation. Those were the purposes, the main purposes, to regulate the office of ministry and worship, to be something cohesive that holds us together. In a sense, we could say, we've done that. In a sense, we can check that box and say, we now have common liturgies, and we have a long history of seminary education on the territory of this new world. We don't need to import pastors from Germany anymore. As we turn then into the era of William Passavant, our Synod led the way in starting agencies and institutions of care and learning. You think of the hospitals that William Passavant founded, the old people's home. You can still see that on the stone up in Zillionopol. The orphans' home. These were all things that were needed in society that were not already in place, and they were local efforts that were supported by our synod. The living memory, I think, is gone, but you can see in our history books that congregations brought meals to the orphans. Not too long ago, our congregations were directly supporting the lives of the kids at Glade Run. So much of that has changed. So much of these institutions now are largely funded by US government grants or state grants, that it really is a very different situation. But our work of organizing and founding those institutions changed one more time, I believe, and this is why it's so emotional. I think this is our recent memory. Synod was the vehicle by which our people, putting cash, because that's what people had then, in the offering plate in their local congregation, could be brought together and support our agencies and institutions. So much has changed since then that now many of our agencies and institutions receive more direct support from congregations and individuals than through the synod, which means we are still supporting these agencies and institutions, but in a different way, because the synod is no longer needed for people to support this work. However, having these titles of these ministry partners in our budget is essential to remember, to remind us this is our larger partnership in ministry. So what our Budget and Finance Committee has done is included a token, a $1,000 base line grant for each of these. And when I say token, what I mean is kind of this is our baseline. We are remembering you actively by name in our budget. And then included larger amounts for some for various reasons. One reason would be historical, another would be constitutional mandates, another would be local circumstances. So the Lutheran Campus Ministry of Pittsburgh, historically, our synod has largely supported the staff of that ministry through synod grant. And it looks like we are not going to be able to continue that. So we have begun to reduce that with conversation with the board, and are starting to ask the difficult question, how can our synod sustain campus ministry in a different pattern, with a different shape? That's a fundamental question and conversation we need to have, but that $50,000 reflects that decrease. You also see $50,000 in the United Lutheran Seminary line item. This has been very large historically because of a constitutional mandate that synods support, following a formula, the seminaries that they relate to. And we're finding again that the local support of seminaries and the very good work of gift planning has left that relationship in a different place. So we're working with ULS to move our support from the synod budget to local congregations and individuals that the seminary will work to develop directly. The next two that are above $1,000 are LAMPA. And again, this is a ministry partner that does not enjoy the same widespread congregational support that many of our other partners do. And so that number is a little bit higher. And the last is Christian Associates of Southwest Pennsylvania. Many of you are familiar with how precious the work of Liddy Barlow is for our whole region, and not just our church, but for many churches. She is a convener of bishops, and she in her person has the capacity to bring together very many separate church traditions, even quite diverse church traditions. We have on the call a former executive director in the person of Pastor Green, and we thank you for your historical work that has done exactly that as well. In your time when you were leader of that organization, you embodied that coming together of very disparate Christian traditions. Lydia is now doing that. Largely, the Catholic Diocese of Pittsburgh has funded that. They are in a very different position now, and are finding that their ability to fund Christian associates is greatly diminished. So we are including a larger amount in our budget than years past to help offset that to some degree. You can see how the totals add up. Of course, the Budget and Finance Committee made jokes with each other about the $467 surplus that, you know, what in the world will we do with all this bounty? The reality is, even this very different, very mission statement focused and guided budget may not be feasible, depending on where this crisis takes us. But it's the best we have for right now. So I am going to ask for comments and try to respond to you in a fair way. Melissa, I don't know whether it is best to leave this on the screen. Pastor Pasquin, yes, please.
We do have a question from Ron Brown asking about other synods' commitment to the 50% level across the church, or in particular in Region 8. I've been trying to find the information and have not been able to locate it easily online.
I have that on a yellow Post-it note at my office. If you want to break into my office and look just to the top left of my keyboard, you may find those numbers. Or it's maybe not important. Here's the sum. I mean, it fits on a Post-it note, right? So throughout the whole church, Region 8 as a whole is above average with our percentage. I think the percentage is around 45, 46% across the whole church, and Region 8 is about 47, 48%, something like that. Within our region, our synod is above average in that our region is about, together as a region, 47, 48%, something like that, and we have been at 49 or 50%. The spread goes from 55% clear down into the 30s, especially for synods that are not financially viable in and of themselves. And I think of Slovak Zion, I think of the Caribbean Synod, and to some extent Alaska as well. This is part of the pattern of our church, that together we all support the work of the whole church, and it's part of the pattern of our synod as well. We all contribute mission support that helps the whole synod, even though each congregation is drastically different from the next. But that's a summary of where we are. Alyssa's screen sharing has gone away. I can see very many more of you now than I could before. I would invite you to go ahead and, oh, look, there are the averages. Thank you, Pastor Stoller. What you see on this email are the regions 1 through 9. Melissa, do you want to lead us through that?
Sure, hopefully we're all seeing the same thing. So this is the average per region. I will pull up the next bit that gives the average that we have. Well, that's a longer document I need to find. Sorry, I'm still searching. But here's the average per region, and actually Region 8 down here. This is an email that actually Bishop had sent out after our last Synod Council meeting. So that's why I just figured it would be easier to pull that up right now. But as a region, we are above the church average, as Bishop writes right here. And as a synod within our region, our current 50% is well above our region's average. But that is also just to hold in mind that 2 synods within our region are also a part of the pilot synod or the experimental synod.
Right.
Which, as a brief description, if you're not aware, these are some synods who have decided to reserve a good portion of their mission support that they send on to the ELCA. So they're closer at the 25 and 35% that they're sending on, in order that their director for evangelical mission is paid for from the synod funds, as well as some other church-wide expenses. So just as an aside, my position as your assistant and director for evangelical mission is actually a church-wide position, and it is not included in the staff salary support that you would see in our synod budget line items. So just as a note on that. But here's where we kind of fit. I will look for more detailed regional information and get that to you, but here's where we fit just within all the other regions, and Region 8 is right here. And for those who are also not familiar, Region 8 includes Northwest Pennsylvania, Southwest Pennsylvania, Allegheny Synod, Upper Susquehanna, Lower Susquehanna, West Virginia, Western Maryland, Baltimore, Delaware, Maryland Synod, and Metro DC Synod. Thank you.
Thank you, Pastor. I saw a chat from Brandon Johns asking, are we wondering more creatively about leasing space? Brandon, do you want to say something about that so we get your question actually rather than interpreted?
There I go. Hi, good morning.
Good morning.
I was just wondering that in light of experience in this way that we've had now, I mean, that my question as typed is kind of what I'm wondering, if we can be more nimble using building spaces that we collectively, have together across our, individual church buildings, and the online communication that we're able to facilitate now. I mean, I know that when we're able to be together in person, especially for some of the tasks that your office has to attend to, is far better than anything like this. I mean, I take that, but I'm just saying we have arranged throughout our territory buildings already in such a way that we could be nimble and pivot to that need, so that way we wouldn't have to pour more money into building space.
Good, thank you, Brandon. I really appreciate that. Yes, one of the things we had already pretty clearly determined was that in whatever space we would lease, we would not have a large meeting space like is currently available in our chapel, which means our Synod Council would not be able to meet at the Synod office. We had planned on going to congregations or ministry partner facilities for our Synod Council meetings, planning to have in the leased Synod office space a conference room, kind of like we have now, that could accommodate 10 or 12 people, individual offices, some shared workspace, some portion of the resource center. That's what we had planned on. The current crisis that we are in has demonstrated the capacity, I would say growing capacity, that we have for meeting virtually. It is inexpensive, requires very little travel and very little actual building space. It's also tedious and wearying in a way that being together can be, and it is joyful and lovely in a way that being together can be. It's both of those things. But Brandon, your question is something we are thinking about even now. We have not signed a lease. We are exploring active options. But the longer this crisis goes on and the longer it takes for us to sell our building, the more time we have to answer that question in a way that will fit our future. Thank you for that excellent question.
Can I have a follow-up, Bishop?
Sure, Ron.
Yeah, so my question was there consideration given when we looked at benevolence, because we cut our Synod ministry partners? Did we take into consideration of reducing Synod benevolence by 1% or 2% to continue to fund our on-site ministries here in Pittsburgh?
Yes, thank you. That was taken into consideration, and the way that that lives out, which you may have caught this detail in my email to Bob Cairns that Pastor Stoller put on the shared screen. At the very bottom of that email, um, I mentioned that we're above average, which is, you know, everyone wants to be above average, and that's a good thing. That would be true even if the way we calculate our proportionate share is to take out the $25,000 and call the 700,000 our proportionate share. That drops us to 48.2 or something like that, rather than 50. That question, I think, is on the table. I think the Budget and Finance Committee was open to thinking about that. And that question carries with it, I mean, everything is interconnected, but we know that the collateral impact of a congregation turning its outward focused ministry inward because of need. And if our outward focused ministry is redirected, that's one thing. If our outward focused ministry is reduced to turn inward, that's another thing. And I mean, I think we're wrestling with it. Yes, it's on the table, and it may be a place where we do come. My hope is that as we answer that question, we keep before us a mission statement, that the purpose, what we are about, what we want to accomplish, is to connect our congregations and to serve and equip them so they can tell the story of Jesus. And whatever gets us there is where we want to be headed. But thank you for bringing that up.
Bishop Castro, may I jump in here?
Yes, you may. Welcome, Josh.
Hello, everyone. So just kind of looking at the different budgets and the email that was shared about what each region is able to give. Economics aside, I'm wondering, I'm trying to figure out the way to word this, how each synod is investing their resources, not only monetarily, but you know, sending people to seminary, sending people to college, and how when those people are in seminary and how when those people are in college, how that's affecting what churches are willing to give to those institutions.
Yes, thank you.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, one of the things that ULS is doing right now is tying their ask to the very specific names and stories of individual students. And that is one of the reasons why this section of our budget is the most emotional. We can see somebody's story, we want to help, and we want to contribute in that way. Your question was, how are we investing? And not only financially, but in leaders. One of the things that I think we are really trying to do is to imagine what will the church of the future be like, what kind of leaders do we need for that future, and how can we go about raising up those leaders now. If ever there was a time in the church when we had that on autopilot, it is no longer there. We have to keep asking that question year after year. What does the church look like now? What do we need in leaders now? How can we prepare them for that? The president of ULS, and before that, the president of Gettysburg Seminary, would meet annually with the bishops of Region 8. And in the brief time that I have been in this office, that conversation has moved more and more toward that agenda. The seminary president asking the bishops, what does the church look like now? What do you need now? What can we be doing to raise up the leaders that you need? So I think part of our investment is always pursuing that question as actively and creatively as we can. What I see as I look as far into the future as I can see is a greater need for lay leadership in our church. and a greater capacity for our rostered ministers to care for more than one congregation. Perhaps to do so in teamwork with another partner in ministry, maybe a pastor and deacon working together, maybe a small group of pastors and deacons working together. But to me, what it's looking like is more like the early days of the church when, and I'll use the word, bishops had a number of congregations in a city with active lay leadership. It just seems to me that, you know, if you talk about canoeing the mountains and the vehicle that's got us here and the thing we are leaving right now while we're getting on horseback to go into the mountains, that vehicle in our living memory has been an individual congregation with its own building, used primarily for Sunday morning and education and social gatherings, and also hosting community events, paying its own pastor, compensation and benefits. I think that vehicle and its membership renewed by its own members, I think that that vehicle is changing. And what we will see more and more will be those with the luxury of a solid theological education being fewer in our system, and lay leaders being more in our system, and our gatherings perhaps being multiple gatherings under the care of a staff of pastors and deacons together. That I am no prognosticator and I have no crystal ball, but that's where my gut tells me we are heading. So our investment, I think, needs to be in raising up rostered ministers who have the capacity and interest to collaborate with each other rather than to be independent of each other. To invest in raising up lay leaders to care for a lot of the ministry that's happening right now. That's what I see, Josh. Thanks for your
Bishop.
Yes, ma'am.
Bishop. The thing that I think is different, and interestingly, with my two congregations combining, we found some historical stories about my two churches, Trinity New Brighton and Redeemer Monaca, had a relationship where they shared a pastor in the late 1800s. Something that everybody had forgotten by this point. And so we found that it was very interesting. One of the concerns that I have, having been a pastor of multiple congregations, is that lay leaders don't necessarily have the time that they had. So there aren't as many lay leaders with the time that they had in the late 1800s because everybody works.
Yeah.
And also, most definitely, we have to invest on lay leadership education, because I do think in the past we had lay leaders had a better education in biblical studies than they do today, if I could say it that way.
Maybe all of our members.
Yeah, right. And I think those are two challenges that look different than when we shared pastors in the early days to what we have going on currently. And I think they can be addressed.
Yep.
I just think we need to think about it.
Good, thank you. Right, when you, I'll stop talking and give you more opportunity. Pastor Green, I saw the beginning of your chat, which was a grief that our agencies and institutions are going to have to, and then it went ... and on my little chat screen, and I think where you were headed was spend more of their time in resource development than care of people. Would you want to say a word about that?
My concern is that our agencies and institutions will now be spending the equivalent of our synodical revenue income in resource development. Now, granted, some of that goes towards getting government grants and foundation grants, but nonetheless, they're going to have to spend more in resource development, competing against each other and against the Synod for congregational and individual support. When you know, when our Synod bylaws talk about interdependence and partnership support as being part of our purpose. My question was, will we see congregations who have traditionally trusted the Synod to equitably share their, quote, benevolence dollars with agencies and institutions now start reducing their or dividing their mission support among the agencies and institutions and giving less to the Synod?
Yes, thank you. I think what you ask is where we have been for some time, that congregations and individuals have already been interested in giving more directly, sometimes resulting in smaller offerings to their congregations, and sometimes resulting in smaller mission support revenues. So I think that's already been happening. But I'd like to respond with what I see is a larger pattern of a change in the way that our organizations and institutions are caring for people. I hinted at this a little earlier when the orphans' home and the old people's home were literally supported by our congregations, and now it is illegal for us to do that. They've had to change in a way that accommodates the changing climate. One of the changes that I think we should open our eyes and look at, our $10,000 investment in the gift planner is yielding over the long haul hundreds of thousands of dollars in support for our ministry partners. Now, we could take that $10,000 and pull our partnership in the gift planner and distribute it between our mission partners, and I think it would be much less useful to them in the long haul, in a changing climate. I don't know, Pastor Stoller, I can't see your face on the first screen. If you want to say a word about the mood of the development officers in our ministry partners working together rather than competing, if that's something that you have found.
Yeah, sorry, my mind went like 12 different directions. Also chatting with people, all above board. Mostly, this has been happening for a while already. This is what we're seeing in congregations already, as well as within our partnership. So one of the things that I work to do is to bring together the development directors and those who act as development directors, which some are executive directors themselves, to have conversations about this, share best practices, as well as sort of the work that is done in religious fundraising. And most everyone expected this and said, but are there ways that we can partner together a little bit better? So for example, working with Lauren and doing the Tuesday emails that go out and other sorts of communications. How can we connect people with each other better? How can we just share the ministry that we're doing better? And then how can we share, this is what I've also heard from development directors, just how much our congregations, which is our Synod, are supporting us in various ways, in kind as well as financially, because Synod is not just the things that we funnel through the Synod office, but this is who we are and how we are together. So just shaping the story of what we're actually doing a little bit better is a way that we can engage this. That was our huge plan, is to get better and better at that. And I think it still is very much a part of our work before this sort of changed everything. But and I want to just lift up a little something that Pastor Van Driel has put up here. Also, a number of our organizations have applied for and received grants from the Ethel Verney Fund. And there are other ways that we can fund and engage, and this is Synod funding, right? It may be particularly directed funding, but it is Synod funding, what we all engage together to do. So just telling that story, I think, helps to shape that better. Is that sort of where you were hoping to go, Bishop?
Absolutely, thank you, and thank you.
You're at somebody else.
No, and thank you, Pastor Vendriel, also for raising that up. The truth is, when we received the Ethel Burney gift, it was more than double our annual synod revenue. And that changed then the capacity and the means by which our synod supports partner ministries. The same could be said for ULS, which received, I think, a $30 million bequest. It changed the shape of how it goes about its work. And I think that's the best answer I can give these days is we are trying to change along with those realities and be faithful along the way. Peter, did you have a comment you wanted to bring to our verbal attention?
Hi, Deacon Rick Frederick posted a few minutes ago two things that folks should be aware of. One is that the Camp Agape is still planning for summer, but they're starting to think outside the box in terms of what could be on the horizon this summer, and are considering something more like a day camp in congregations as opposed to a residential camp at the camp itself. So just to recognize that, like all of us, trying to figure out what the future is like, Rick and the team at Camp Agape are thinking outside the box and thinking creatively. Also note that his wife fell yesterday and they are headed to the orthopedist this afternoon. So he did ask for prayers for his wife.
Thank you. I'm seeing that we are turning the corner around 11 o'clock, and we have, the last time we did this, identified 11:30 as kind of our end time. I want to ask if you have further questions of clarity about the budget, or if you're ready to end our recording and move in more to a ministerial conversation in which we check in with each other and ask, how are you doing? What do you need? And what have you seen or done that has been a learning, a good and useful thing that we can all share together? I think we're ready to move in that direction. Pastor Stoller, do you want to navigate that for us?
I will stop the recording. Thank you.